I am Conor MacLeod of the clan MacLeod. I was born in 1518 in the village of Glenfinnan on the shores of Loch Shiel. And I am immortal.
No, it's not that MacLeod, obviously. We're talking about Nicholas M. MacLeod and the MacLeod attack, named after him. So he has a few other defenses named after him as well, such as the MacLeod defense in the King's Gambit Accepted, which goes e4, e5, f4, pawn takes pawn, King's Gambit Accepted, knight f3, and then knight to c6, the MacLeod defense. But the MacLeod attack, also called the Lopez opening, is something entirely different and starts out with e4, e5, and then simply c3. There are a few ways to continue this opening. So if you look at the board, signaling the MacLeod attack, Black's most popular and best continuation would be d5, and the normal continuation would be pawn takes pawn, and then queen takes pawn, the idea of which is that white can no longer develop his knight naturally to chase away the queen. And this is my preferred way of playing the MacLeod attack, but there are other ways as well. So if we go back, e4, e5, c3, the MacLeod attack, and then d5, the book move, we see that there are also two aggressive variations with the queen. So queen to h5 or queen to a4. If we play queen to h5, the play can continue into something which is called the Norwaldi Gambit of the MacLeod attack, which goes e4, e5, c3, d5, the aggressive queen to h5, which attacks the pawn on e5 with check and also pins the pawn on f7. But now Black may continue with a gambit of his own, which is bishop to d6, offering up the d5 pawn. But Black has got good compensation with fast developments of the knight on f3, kicking back the queen. So Black will be down a pawn, but has excellent piece activity. I'm not sure this is called the Norwaldi Gambit. If you look at other sites, some call it the Nullwaller Gambit with an L. But if you look at other openings, like in the King's Gambit Norwaldi variation, it is spelled Norwaldi with an R or Norwalder with two R's. So Norwaldi with one R is probably the correct pronunciation. If you look at chess tempo, the aggressive queen to a4 has been played in master play with a loss for white, but there's only one game available. So let's see how I do in my game using this variation. Opponent will be an engine called Jonny400 with 2700 rating. So now let's take a look at the game I played. So the game starts out with e4, e5, c3, and then d5. And now I play the aggressive queen to a4, which not only checks the enemy king, but also covers the pawn on e4. And there are plenty of ways to defend against it. Black may block with the king, the queen. He may block with the bishop, the knight, again with the knight, or simply advance the pawn. And Jonny chooses the bishop to defend, regaining tempo with an attack on the queen. So I remaneuver queen to b3, And again we see a few attacks available for white. We are attacking the pawn on b7. There are 2 attacks on the pawn on d5. But most importantly, after the exchange, we will see an attack on the weak f7 square. And that's important because in this formation we can also develop the bishop to add even more pressure to that square. So Jonny continues with bishop to c6, protecting the pawn and protecting the pawn on b7. I continue with knight to f3, creating a new attack on the pawn on e5. If black wants to exchange pawns, this will only activate my queen, so I have no problem there. Black instead plays knight to d7, protecting the pawn. I play d4, looking to mess the center up and create lines for my pieces. And black continues to attack my pawn center, and he starts with e takes d. I continue with c takes d, so I am willing to play with an isolated pawn. Pawn takes pawn, and now knight to g5. And this move has 2 purposes. It creates one attack on the pawn on e4, which is currently protected, but it also creates an attack and a checkmate on the weak pawn on f7. So that is of course the first thing that black has to defend against. So I am down 1 pawn, but with good attacking possibilities. Black defends with queen to f7 to protect the pawn. I continue the pressure with bishop to c4, and we can see now I have 3 pieces available attacking the weak pawn on f4. Black must bring a second piece into the defense, which is knight to h6. Now other moves are not possible. If, let's say, black were to try queen takes pawn, which is not protected, I can continue bishop takes pawn check, and then either king to e7, queen to e6 check, king to d8 with a checkmate. So that won't work. Alternatively, king to d8 will lead to knight to e6, forking queen and king. So it's not possible for black to recapture my pawn at this point. If instead of queen takes pawn, black castles immediately, we see that knight takes pawn allows a fork against the 2 rooks, so that will also be losing for black. So we can see that it's hard for black to defend against it, and he cannot get the king out of the way immediately. So knight to h6 is the only move, an awkward defense. I continue with knight to c3. Now I have 2 attackers on the pawn on e4 trying to recapture, and it may lead to an attack on the enemy queen. It is possible for black to castle at this point, after which perhaps the best continuation for white is to start defending the pawn, but this wasn't played. Instead, queen to g6 is played. protecting the pawn and still protecting the other pawn on f7. So I continue simply with castling. Black plays bishop to e7, getting ready to castle kingside. If we go back and black tries to castle queenside, we see the problem with simply bishop takes pawn on f7, attacking the queen. And if knight recaptures again, and we can see that we are forking both rooks. So we have to go back, and castling queenside isn't possible at the moment. Bishop to e7 instead, in order to castle kingside. We note that at this point there are two attackers on the knight on g5. But I'm going to ignore this completely and simply continue developing with rook to e1, rook to the half open file. Jonny takes on the knight, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and queen takes bishop. And it looks like I'm down a minor piece, but if you look at the bishop on c6, it becomes clear that that bishop has become trapped. So d5 in order to get the minor piece back, and we can see that we can also create an attack with tempo after rook takes pawn on e4. So what is black to do? If bishop takes pawn, bishop takes bishop, and we can see an attack on the b7 square. Also two attacks on the pawn on e4 with tempo, which would be bad for black. So that's not played. If black castles long, I can grab the bishop, and if attacking the knight, and if pawn recaptures, we see the danger of bishop to a6, which is a checkmate. So that's also not possible. So let's go back. Black simply castles to get out of the danger, which is probably the best move. I continue with knight takes pawn, attacking the queen. Now we note that if instead of knight takes pawn I would have played rook takes, black is able to fork queen and rook. So recapturing with the rook is not possible, but recapturing with the knight is fine, and we get an attack on the queen, which we may harass for a while. Queen goes to f5. I take the bishop. Black recaptures. So at this point I'm still down a pawn, but they're doubled isolated pawns, so that's not too big of a deal. Plus I still have a strong attack going with queen and bishop on the b3 Ga diagonal. I play h3, a defensive move that prevents the jumping of the knight to g4, and we can see that now at the board at h6 the knight has essentially become stuck. Black plays knight to e5. I play knight to g3, again harassing the queen. Queen moves, still trying to protect the f7 square and also protecting the knight on e5. So obviously the knight is trying to get rid of my bishop and the strong attack and on the diagonal that I have. Knight to h5, continue to pressure the queen. queen to f5, still protecting the pawn on f7 and the knight on e5. And now the best attack for white is queen to c3, adding 2 attackers to the knight on e5. And we notice that our bishop on c4 is under attack, as well as our knight on c5, but they cannot be recaptured, because if, say, knight takes bishop, we simply get queen takes pawn on g7 checkmate. So that can't be played. Alternatively, if the queen takes on the knight on h5, I can recapture the knight with the rook, attacking the queen, and there are only 2 places for the queen to move to. So if queen to h4, for instance, I can play g4, and the problem is the knight on h6, which is now trapped and cannot move anywhere. So if a random move is played, say a6, we get g5, and black will lose the knight. But black also cannot counterplay with f6, counterattacking the rook, because this pawn is pinned by the bishop on c4. So in order to do so, black must first move his king to h8, but if he does so, I can continue my attack with rook to h5, attacking the queen and the knight. So the queen has to flee, after which I can simply take on the knight on h6, and the rook cannot be recaptured because we have a second pin with the queen. Alternatively, if you go back, the queen doesn't have to move to h4. It can also move to g6, after which perhaps a good continuation would be rook to c5, attacking the pawn on c6 and c7, after which, let's say, rook to c8, I can already simply grab the first pawn. Rook takes pawn on c6, and we notice the rook cannot be recaptured by the queen, because if queen takes rook, I get a discovered attack with a check. Bishop takes pawn check, and black will lose the queen. So that cannot be played. What white may do to continue is later on play rook a to c1, after which we can see an Alekhine's gun forming on the board after moving the bishop away from c4, which will allow white to grab the second pawn, leading for a winning endgame for white. So those 2 variations will not work. So let's go back. After rook takes, there are 2 moves possible for the queen, and they are both losing. So if you go back again, after my bishop being threatened and my knight on h5 being threatened, none of them can be captured. So black instead goes on the defense and plays rook f to e8. Now there's a threat of knight takes bishop on c4, so I remaneuver my bishop to e2, also protecting my knight on h5. Game continues with g6, and that's a bit of a blunder by Jonny, because it opens up the square on f6 for a fork between king and rook. But I cannot play knight to f6 just yet, because the queen is covering that square. So we need to get rid of this queen. And we do so simply by playing bishop to g4. And now there's only one square available for the queen in order to move to, that will still protect the f6 square. Of course, there are other possibilities. Our bishop is under attack by the queen, the knight, and the other knight. And this knight is under attack by the queen and the pawn. But they will all fail, because if, say, queen goes to g5, we can see that there are still a few squares available for the queen to move to in order to protect the f6 square, but none of them will be safe. After queen to g5, we can play f4, and this will force the queen back perhaps to queen to d8, after which we can bring the rook in, rook a to d1, and again we see very little squares available for the queen to go to safety. So we see there are only two squares available for the queen in order to protect the f6 square. So if queen goes to h4, it can simply be kicked away with g3, so that won't work. Alternatively, if queen moves to f7, I can crash through with tempo, rook takes knight, attacking the queen, and if the queen moves, there's no longer any protection available for the e6 square, and we will get our fork with knight to f6. So those moves can't be played. Alternatively, if the queen doesn't move, but if the knight takes out the bishop on g4, we get the checkmate, so that cannot be played. Or if the other knight takes out the bishop, we can grab the knight with the pawn on h3, attacking the queen, and again we present the same problem for black. Where can he move to in order to protect the f6 square? So if the queen grabs the pawn, we get a triple fork, so that will not work. If the queen moves to g5, f4 will fork queen and knight, so that will not work. If the queen moves to d7, we get the triple fork, so that won't work. If the queen moves to e6, we get f4, kicking away the knight, which is needed to protect the queen against the rook, so that won't work. Or alternatively, if the knight takes on the pawn, we get the checkmate. So none of those variations will work. So let's go back. After this position, knight takes bishop was played, pawn takes pawn, so my knight is under attack. Black flees to e6, covering the f6 square. I go forward with my attacking idea f4, chasing away the knight. Now, if the knight is taken right now, my knight with pawn takes knight, rook can recapture, attacking the queen, after which if say queen takes g4, black will lose the queen, check, and a fork with the queen. Alternatively, he may try queen to d7, after which rook to g5 check, king to f8, queen to h8 check, king to e7, and we can bring our final rook into the game. Rook e5 check, king d6 perhaps, and rook to d1 checkmate. Alternatively, if not king to d6 and he flees to d8, we can grab the rook, queen recaptures, rook to d1 check, forcing the loss of the queen after king to c8. Alternatively, king to e7, rook to e1, queen to d4 check, and again we will see black will lose his queen. So that's a bad continuation for black, but it wasn't played. After f4, black realizes that his knight is lost. He doesn't recapture my knight on h5 and plays f6 instead. I continue with bringing my knight to safety to g3. The knight on e5 is already lost. Queen to c4. We exchange material. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes queen. Pawn takes queen. Pawn takes pawn. And now we are approaching the endgame. I am down a few pawns, but I am up a minor piece. And I will just grind down my opponent until I can promote and win the game. So, rook to the open file. Knight develops. a4, looking to promote the a pawn. Rook to b7, trying to get rid of the c7 or a7 pawn. Rook to a7, attacking that pawn. I grab the a5 pawn, and black grabs the c4 pawn. And I quietly try and promote my a pawn. And now I will need to bring my knight and rook into the attack in order to promote. I try to exchange rooks, but Jonny doesn't bite. I try again with rook to f2. So I finally need to bring my rook and knight in order to block the a file. And finally I can promote, leading to the winning game for white. And knight to a5 is the checkmate. So that was my game against Jonny400 using the aggressive Queen A4 variation of the MacLeod attack. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Please like, leave a comment, and have a great evening.
There can be only one.